We have been spending the last few weeks
looking at the disciple Simon Peter and discovering some lessons that Peter teaches us as he spent his 3 years following Christ. And we started several weeks ago with the story of Peter being called by Jesus to come follow him, and we learned that we need to go fish. This is going to be one of those audience participation sermons, so just so you're aware. We learned that we need to go fish. And then the second week, we came to the story about Jesus walking to the disciples on the water during the storm and calling Peter to come out to him, and learn that sometimes we need to get out of the boat. And then last week, Peter's story took us to Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus praised Peter and told him that upon this rock he would build his church one moment, and then in the next scolding Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." And we learned that we need to be the bedrock, be the rock for others' faith and not a stumbling block. I shared with you a story last week about a young fisher among us, about how he found some opportunities to be a fisher this week. Well, I've got another one, and I got to let you know, folks, I got to give you a warning. These kids, they're kind of up in the bar on you here a little bit. Over at Christmas time, or back at Christmas time, our children decided that they wanted to participate in Operation Shoebox, and spent some of the money that they collect during children's time getting the supplies. And Rachel, did they do six? 6 shoeboxes went to children around the world. And the neat thing about this worldwide ministry is that you can track where your box goes. And so the kids knew that one of their boxes went to Mexico. And they got a response from that child. And not only were our kids fishers, showing the love of Christ to this child, his name is Fabian. And Fabian is a fisher himself, because this community that they meet in, they are in a Sunday school club that meets in the yard of a Christian lady next door. And they bring their offering each week, which is maybe 2 to 5 pennies in our currency. And they put that together and are able to buy a gallon of milk for a single mom, or they're able to buy cookies for an elderly person who lives alone. So when you fish, it's contagious. So I wanted to share what our kids are continuing to, or how they are continuing to be fishers of men and women and boys and girls, even in Mexico. Well, today we're coming to Jesus' final days that he spent with his disciples. And we are at the night where Jesus shared his Last Supper with his disciples, and the night that he was arrested. And we're going to be spending a couple of weeks on this particular story. But let's get us geographically caught up to where we are. Last week we were in Caesarea Philippi. Would have been about 20 miles or so north of Capernaum, which was the home base operation of Jesus. And so the disciples returned there, and they stayed there for a bit of time. And then they began, you can see Capernaum at the top of the map, right by the Sea of Galilee. After spending a little bit of time resting there, they began the 100-mile journey to Jerusalem. They went by Jericho, and you can kind of see it towards the lower third of the screen up there. When they get to Jericho, they encounter a tax collector named Zacchaeus, who was a little vertically challenged and had to climb a sycamore tree to see Jesus. This is actually a sycamore tree in Jericho. Our bishop may or may not have encouraged my husband to get a running start and climb the tree, but I can assure you that his wife stopped him. So, by way of Jericho, they entered in Jerusalem, and so they entered Jerusalem from the east, and they would have come down from the Mount of Olives. And this is the site that Jesus would have seen coming down into the city of Jerusalem. Now, word spread that Jesus was coming. And so people were excited. They brought palm branches. They waved them as Jesus came by. And palm branches were a Jewish sign of victory. And as people waved their branches, they shouted, "Hosanna," which means "deliver us now." The Israelites had been waiting for an earthly king that was going to lead them in overthrowing the Roman Empire. And the person that they thought was that king was riding into Jerusalem, the city that the greatest king, King David, had built. Now, until this moment, Jesus had always told his disciples, "Okay, you know I'm the Messiah. Don't tell anybody." That had been his message up until now. Well, now he welcomed people saying, "Our Messiah is coming," because he knew that the time was coming for God's plan to be fulfilled. He knew that the end was near, and that this display that was going on as he was riding into Jerusalem would start the events that would lead to his arrest later that week. Now, during this week that Jesus spends in Jerusalem before he is crucified, there are some highly contentious events that happened. This is the time that Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple and overturned their tables and took a whip and ran them out. He was preaching and teaching and criticizing the religious leaders in their own house, so to speak. It's one thing to criticize the religious leaders in Capernaum. It's another thing to criticize them in the temple grounds. They didn't take too well to that. The religious leaders didn't like the message that he was hearing. Jesus foretold the destruction of the temple, that it would be destroyed and not one stone would be left upon one another. So he made a lot of people really angry in a short amount of time. Tensions were high in Jerusalem that week, and you could feel it. So on Thursday morning of that week, Jesus instructed Peter and John to go into town. They would spend their days within the temple walls in the old city of Jerusalem, and then they would return to the Mount of Olives. That's where they spent the night. So Peter and John are instructed to go into town and make preparations for the Passover meal for the group. Now, in all likelihood, they had no idea that this was going to be the last meal that they would share together. And when the disciples walked in the room that night, they would have removed their sandals and left them by the door. At the children's sermon, we kind of set this part up. Now, it was the custom to remove the shoes because shoes tracked in dirt. And in a culture without sofas or lazy boys, people sat on the floor. And so they didn't want to be around dirty, smelly feet. The dining table would have been on the floor, and people would have ate while reclining back on cushions and pillows. So when you are sitting down to eat and someone's feet are this far away from you, you really hope those feet are clean. And so the custom was to have a pitcher of water and a basin and a towel by the door for people entering to have their feet washed. If there was a household servant, the servant would have done that. But if there wasn't, people would have done it themselves. Now, the Gospel of John is the only one that tells us the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And this is that story. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from the world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my head and my hands." Jesus said to him, "One who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him, and for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he washed their feet, had put on his robe and returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you." The fact that Jesus washed the disciples' feet tells us that while they might have removed their shoes, none of them had stopped to wash their own feet. I wonder why that is, considering that it was just common courtesy. When you walked into someone's house, you washed your feet. Think of it like wiping your shoes on the mat before you enter someone's house today. It was expected. So I wonder why they didn't wash their feet. I wonder if maybe it was because if they stopped to wash their own feet, that it would be expected that they had to wash everybody else's. And nobody wanted to do it. Nobody wanted that job. So shortly after they sit down to dinner, Jesus got up and retrieved the water and the basin and the towel, took his clothes off, and started washing their feet. I imagine everyone was uncomfortable. Like the reactions of the kids. "Jesus, no! You shouldn't be washing my feet. I should be washing yours. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. You're not going to wash my feet." But while all of them might have been thinking about it, Peter was the only one who said anything about it. "You will never wash my feet." They all realized that it should be the other way around. But Peter said it. "You're not going to wash my feet." But Christ was doing so much more than just washing their feet. He was teaching them, and he was giving them an example to follow. "Just as I have done to you, you also must do." Now, like I shared with the kids, the lesson for us today isn't really about feet. It isn't really about washing feet. The example was good for the disciples because it was culturally relevant at the time, but that's not a part of our culture. Now, I'm not against a good ceremonial foot washing, but I'm not sure that this is what we as 21st century Christians should be taking away from this story. I think the lesson for us today is about servanthood. Jesus was showing the disciples and us that, as we heard earlier from the Luke text, to be great, we need to be willing to assume the role of a servant. But what does that mean? I've spent quite a bit of time this week thinking about this question. I had a conversation earlier in the week with someone that we were talking about what exactly servanthood means and what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. And boy, I wrestled with this. Because that's the thing about being a Christian. Just when you think you've got it figured out, God comes along and says, wait a minute. And I got to tell you, folks, it stunk. It sucked canal water. It really did. But growth usually is painful. It's not very comfortable. So these are kind of some of my thoughts. They're not finished by any stretch of the imaginations. But as I wrestled with this thought and was listening to God this week, these are some of the things that He shared with me. When we consider the role that a servant plays, oftentimes, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, there's this idea of hierarchy. Servants are down here, right? And the people that are served are up here. So sometimes, if someone is a servant, they can be thought of as less than. Someone who is there to fulfill every request and every need and every whim of a person that is in some kind of position over them. And sometimes there are people who think, well, you are my servant, therefore you must do everything that I tell you to do without question and without attitude. If you doubt me on that, the next time you go out to eat, watch how some people treat their server. And anyone who's ever been a waitress or a waiter or a part of a serving staff know exactly what I'm talking about. The problem has nothing to do with being a servant. It has to do with the attitude of the person receiving the service. If they have an attitude of entitlement, you are here to serve me, that makes for a miserable experience on the part of the servant. Paul warns against this in his letter to the Romans. He says, "Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to think." When people allow or even ask or demand others to serve them without offering anything in return, without offering the same kindness or graciousness or generosity that has been given to them, that leads the person who is doing the service to feel resentful, angry, bitter, oppressed. And I've been there. I have served people who act that because this is what Christ has called me to do, because this is what I do as a vocation, that I serve them. And they are not very nice about it. And I have to be honest, when I have an encounter like that, there is no joy in service. There is no pleasure. There is no love as I do it. Does this happen more often than it should? Absolutely. And nobody likes to feel like they're offering something of themselves and serving somebody or doing something for them and feel unappreciated, to feel oppressed, to feel bitter or resentful. Nobody likes doing that. But this is where I experienced what I call a spiritual 2x4 upside my head, where God just kind of comes up and goes, whack. Nobody likes doing that. Nobody likes feeling that way. But the hard truth of the gospel is that Jesus doesn't tell us to be servants only to those who appreciate it. He doesn't tell us to be servants to those who reciprocate it. He tells us to be servants. And that's what makes us different. Even unbelievers do nice things for people who do nice things for them. What makes us different is we will serve those who don't treat us well as we do it. Remember, Judas was among those disciples who had their feet washed. Jesus healed 10 lepers, even though he knew that 9 of them would not come back and thank him. It's the Judases of the world that need to be served the most by God's people, because in doing so, we're showing them love. We're showing them God's love. And they are some of the people most desperate for it. That's the reality. But I don't think that this picture of servanthood is Christ's ideal picture. And I don't know that it's necessarily what he had in mind when he called us to be servants. The idea of servant leadership became popular in the 1970s. If you've had any kind of leadership study, you know the name Robert Greenleaf. He's the one who coined the phrase servant leadership, and he began educating people on the concept that successful leaders, first and foremost, make sure that the needs of those around them are met. It sounded really cool and this new idea, this new concept back in the 1970s, but it wasn't new. Christ did it 2,000 years ago. But what Greenleaf zoned in on was the idea that servanthood is the key to the success of almost anything in life. Relationships are successful when two people act as servants toward each other. They realize that part of their job is to bless the other person, to encourage them, to build them up. They minister to one another. This is an all too often conversation that happens in my house. Todd, I left my phone downstairs. Would you bring it up when you come, please? And that's usually followed by, hey, Aim, I left my wallet in the nightstand. Would you bring it when you come down? You think we would remember our phone and our wallet, but it doesn't even sound like serving each other. But it is. And the reason it works is because we both share an attitude of giving as well as receiving. If only one person gives and only one person receives, it doesn't work. If Todd always brings me my phone, but I never bring him his wallet, what I wrote was, after a while he's going to say, go get your own phone. He wouldn't. He would bring me my phone, and then he would come up and get his wallet, because that's just the kind of person he is. But this idea of give and take is what makes relationships successful. It's the same with organizations. They work when people within the organization are concerned about the welfare of everybody and not just themselves. What Jesus demonstrated for his disciples was that even though he was the Son of God, he was not above serving others. What Peter and his disciples learned is that there is a time to serve and there is a time to be served. I mentioned earlier that the disciples were uncomfortable when Jesus began to wash their feet. Maybe it's because we can all be uncomfortable allowing someone to serve us. When I was pregnant with Josh, had some complications in the pregnancy. And my whole last half of the pregnancy, I couldn't feel my right leg because the little stinker was sitting in a spot where it cut off the nerves to my legs. And so for the last half of my pregnancy, that's how I lived. And I was never so happy to have had a baby in my life because I could feel my leg again. But as a music director of a large church, as a full-time wife, a full-time mother to a 3-year-old and now a newborn, my church rallied to take care of me. Todd and I had been part of a Sunday school class of people that were about our age until the time that we started a worship service during Sunday school. And so I was needed for music in the worship service. And because the bass player of the band had also been the junior high Sunday school teacher, Todd got drafted to teach junior high Sunday school. I'm not kidding when I tell you the man is a saint. Junior high Sunday school? All right. So anyway, we had not been part of this Sunday school for quite a while until Josh was born. And I get a phone call from one of the ladies in the class that says, "Okay, Amy, you're home from the hospital. This couple is bringing you dinner tonight, and this couple is bringing you tomorrow night, and this couple the night after that, and this couple the night after that." And I'm thinking, oh, but I'm okay. I can feel my leg now. I don't need this help. And it's not necessary. And I had a good friend at the time tell me, "Amy, just shut up and let us love you. Let us serve you." None of us like to feel like we need to be in a position that we have to be served. And I get that. But there is a time to serve, and there is a time to be served. And when we allow someone to serve us, they're showing us the love of God. Part of being a good servant, I believe, is also allowing others to serve us. By the 6th century, the popes in Rome had become some of the most powerful people in the world. Until 590, when Pope Gregory I became pope, and he changed how the role of the pope was defined. He believed that his role was to be the servant to the servants of God. I'll say that again, to become the servant to the servants of God. How might our lives change? How might our community change? How might our world change if we all saw this as our mission? That we are the servants of others. We are servants to our partners. We are servants to each other. We are servants of the servants of God. That's the latest lesson that Peter teaches us. Go fish, Get out of the boat. Be a bedrock to someone else's faith. And be a servant. Amen.